February 1945, 25,000 feet over Germany. Ball turret gunner Staff Sergeant James Wilson hears the sound every gunner dreads, the sharp crack of his oxygen hose rupturing. Flak has torn through the fuselage and severed his lifeline. At this altitude, the air is too thin to sustain consciousness. Medical science is clear: 3 minutes of useful consciousness before your brain shuts down. 5 minutes before you pass out completely. 15 minutes before permanent brain damage. 30 minutes before death. But Wilson has a bigger problem. The same flak burst that destroyed his oxygen line has damaged the hydraulics. His ball turret won't rotate back to the exit position. To get out, he has to hand crank the turret using the emergency manual system, a process that takes 15 to 20 minutes of exhausting physical work. His emergency oxygen bottle holds maybe 12 minutes of air. The math is simple and absolutely terrifying. He cannot get out before his oxygen runs out. He should be dead. 6 hours later, Wilson crawled out of that turret alive. Not injured. Not brain damaged. Alive and functional. This is how he survived what medical science said was impossible. At 25,000 feet, atmospheric pressure is less than half of sea level. The air contains the same percentage of oxygen, but there's simply less air. Your lungs can't extract enough oxygen to sustain consciousness. Without supplemental oxygen, you enter hypoxia, oxygen starvation. The timeline is well documented because high-altitude aviation had killed enough pilots by 1945 that the Army Air Force understood the physiology precisely. 0 to 60 seconds after oxygen loss, you feel short of breath but remain fully functional. Your body hasn't realized the danger yet. 60 to 90 seconds, confusion begins. Your thinking becomes clouded. Simple math becomes difficult. This is when pilots make fatal mistakes. They think they're fine while their brain function deteriorates. 2 to 3 minutes, you're still conscious but barely. Your vision starts tunneling. Your hands stop responding properly. You might feel euphoric, a false sense that everything is fine. This euphoria kills people. They feel wonderful while dying. 3 to 5 minutes, you lose consciousness. If oxygen isn't restored in the next few minutes, you don't wake up. 5 to 15 minutes, brain cells start dying. Even if someone puts an oxygen mask on you and revives you at this point, you'll have permanent neurological damage. Beyond 15 minutes without oxygen at 25,000 feet, survival with intact brain function is medically impossible. Ball turret gunners knew this timeline. They trained on it. They'd been in altitude chambers and experienced hypoxia under controlled conditions, so they'd recognize the symptoms. Wilson knew exactly what was happening to his brain as his oxygen hose tore. He knew he had maybe 90 seconds of clear thinking before confusion would make him unable to save himself. The ball turret was completely dependent on oxygen supplied through a hose from the aircraft's main system. The hose had to be long enough, about 15 feet, to allow the turret to rotate fully. That length made it vulnerable. It ran through the fuselage where flak or fighter rounds could hit it. It had connection points that could fail. It could kink or freeze. When it failed, you had one backup, a small emergency oxygen bottle mounted inside the turret. Wilson's emergency bottle held approximately 1,200 liters of oxygen at pressure, enough for 12 to 15 minutes of normal breathing at altitude. But there was nothing normal about his situation. To escape the turret, he had to hand crank it back to the exit position. This required rotating the entire turret about 90 degrees until the entry hatch aligned with the fuselage opening. The hand crank was designed as an emergency backup to the hydraulic system, and it was not easy to operate. The crank mechanism connected to the turret's rotation gears through a series of mechanical linkages. Under normal circumstances with functioning hydraulics, the turret rotated smoothly with minimal effort. With hydraulics failed, every bit of rotation required manual force against the weight of the turret, the guns, the ammunition, and the gunner himself. The Air Force estimated 15 minutes minimum for an experienced gunner to hand crank from any position back to the exit alignment. Some gunners reported it taking 20 minutes or more, especially if battle damage had distorted the turret housing and increased friction on the rotation mechanism. Wilson did the math instantly. 12 minutes of emergency oxygen. 15 to 20 minutes of hand cranking required. He couldn't make it. Even if he started cranking immediately and worked as fast as physically possible, his oxygen would run out before he reached the exit position. Once he passed out, nobody could help him. The entry to the ball turret was through a hatch in the fuselage that only aligned when the turret was in the correct position. His crew couldn't reach him. They couldn't rotate the turret from outside. If he lost consciousness while trapped in the wrong position, he would die in that sphere, and they would have to land the aircraft with his body still in the turret. Wilson made a decision in the first 30 seconds that saved his life. But it defied every instinct and every bit of training. Instead of immediately switching to his emergency oxygen bottle and beginning the frantic hand crank procedure, he stayed on the ruptured main oxygen line for another 30 seconds while he assessed the damage. Those 30 seconds should have killed him. He was burning through his limited clear thinking time. But Wilson was gambling those seconds to gain information. He needed to know if the main oxygen line was completely severed or only partially damaged. He checked his breathing. He could feel air moving through the mask, but it felt thin, insufficient. He checked his mental state, still clear, no confusion yet. He checked the oxygen pressure gauge. It showed flow, but below normal. The hose was torn, not severed. Oxygen was leaking out through the tear, but some was still reaching him. Maybe 40% of normal flow. Maybe less. Not enough to sustain him indefinitely, but enough to extend his time. Wilson switched to his emergency bottle and began hand cranking. But here's where he did something that his training had never covered and that should have killed him even faster. He cranked slowly. Not frantically. Slowly and deliberately. 3 cranks on the handle. Stop. Rest for 5 seconds. Breathe slowly and deeply. 3 more cranks. Stop. Rest. Breathe. Every instinct screamed to crank as fast as possible. Every bit of fear told him to hurry before the oxygen ran out. But Wilson understood something about physiology that overrode panic. Exertion burns oxygen. Rapid breathing burns oxygen. Panic burns oxygen. Fast hand cranking would get him to the exit position quicker, but he would consume his limited oxygen faster and pass out before completing the rotation. Slow, controlled effort with rest intervals would conserve oxygen and extend his survival time. He was betting that slow progress with efficient oxygen use would get him further than fast progress with rapid oxygen depletion. This was a calculated gamble based on understanding his own physiology. Wilson had grown up at high altitude in Colorado. His body had adapted since childhood to function on less oxygen than someone raised at sea level. This adaptation, called hypoxic tolerance, meant his body was more efficient at extracting and using whatever oxygen was available. He couldn't know exactly how much extra time this gave him, but he knew it gave him some buffer beyond what the medical charts predicted for a sea-level adapted person. After 8 minutes of slow, controlled hand cranking, Wilson had rotated the turret about 60 degrees. He was roughly 2/3 of the way to the exit position. His emergency bottle gauge showed less than 3 minutes of oxygen remaining. At his current pace, he needed at least 5 more minutes of cranking to complete the rotation. The emergency bottle couldn't get him there. He made the second decision that should have killed him. He switched back to the ruptured main oxygen line with its 40% flow. The moment he switched, he felt the difference. The air felt thinner. Breathing felt harder. The slight dizziness that he'd been managing carefully became more pronounced. But he remained conscious. The reduced oxygen flow wasn't enough for indefinite survival, but it was enough to keep him conscious for now. Wilson resumed hand cranking on the main line, even slower now. Every 3 cranks, he would stop and rest for 10 full seconds, forcing himself to breathe slowly and steadily despite the overwhelming urge to gasp for air. His vision started to narrow slightly, the first sign of significant hypoxia. His peripheral vision was darkening. But his central vision remained clear enough to see the turret position indicator. At the 14-minute mark, Wilson felt something that terrified him more than the oxygen deprivation itself: euphoria. A sense of well-being washed over him. He felt oddly calm, almost peaceful. This is hypoxic euphoria, one of the most dangerous symptoms of oxygen starvation. The oxygen-starved brain releases endorphins and creates false feelings of contentment. Pilots experiencing hypoxic euphoria have been known to remove their oxygen masks because they feel fine. Climbers on Everest have wandered away from their groups in euphoric confusion. The euphoria is a sign that your brain is dying, but it feels wonderful. Wilson recognized the euphoria. That recognition was critical. The fact that he could identify what was happening meant his cognitive function hadn't deteriorated completely. He still had enough brain activity to override the false signals. He forced himself to keep cranking. 3 cranks. Rest. Breathe. 3 cranks. Rest. Breathe. He focused on the rhythm, the repetition, anything to maintain cognitive function against the encroaching confusion. His vision tunneled further. The periphery went completely dark. He could only see what was directly in front of him, a circle of vision maybe 30 degrees wide, everything else black. This is late-stage hypoxia. He was perhaps 60 seconds from losing consciousness entirely. His hands felt disconnected, like they belonged to someone else. The hand crank felt impossibly heavy. Every rotation required concentration to remember what he was supposed to be doing. At 16 minutes long past when medical science said he should be unconscious and approaching the point where brain damage would be permanent, the turret clicked into position. The alignment indicator showed the entry hatch was now matched with the fuselage opening. Wilson had maybe 15 seconds of consciousness remaining, possibly less. He didn't remember the specific actions of unstrapping from his position. He didn't remember disconnecting the oxygen line from his mask. He operated on pure procedural memory and adrenaline. He pulled himself toward the hatch opening, crawling more than climbing because his legs wouldn't respond properly. His vision was almost completely dark. He felt hands grabbing him from inside the fuselage, other crew members who had been watching the turret rotation indicator and were ready at the hatch the moment it aligned. They pulled him through the opening. Someone ripped his damaged mask off and replaced it with a fresh mask connected to the main oxygen system with full flow. Wilson's memory of the next 2 minutes is fragmented. He remembers the sensation of air, good air, rich oxygen, flooding into his lungs. He remembers the darkness in his vision gradually receding as his peripheral vision returned. He remembers his hands starting to feel like his hands again instead of foreign objects. After about 90 seconds on good oxygen, his cognitive function returned enough that he could understand questions and respond coherently. After 3 minutes, he was functionally normal, if exhausted. The flight engineer checked his pupils equal and reactive. No signs of stroke or brain damage. Somehow, impossibly, he was fine. After the mission, Wilson filed an incident report. The flight surgeon interviewed him extensively. The Army Air Force wanted to understand how he'd survived 16+ minutes of severe oxygen deprivation at 25,000 feet when medical science said he should be dead or brain damaged. The analysis revealed several factors that combined to create survival where none should have existed. First, the hypoxic tolerance from growing up at altitude. Wilson's body had adapted since childhood to function more efficiently with limited oxygen. His blood carried more red blood cells. His tissues were more efficient at extracting oxygen from blood. His brain had adapted to function on lower oxygen partial pressure. These adaptations gave him perhaps an extra 2 to 3 minutes of functional consciousness compared to someone raised at sea level. Second, the partial oxygen flow from the damaged hose. While only 40% of normal flow, this wasn't zero. The reduced oxygen kept his blood oxygen saturation from dropping to zero. It wasn't enough to prevent hypoxia, but it was enough to slow the progression. Instead of complete oxygen starvation, he had severe oxygen deficiency. The distinction saved his life. Third, the controlled breathing and deliberate pacing. By forcing himself to crank slowly and breathe steadily rather than gasping or hyperventilating, Wilson maximized the efficiency of the limited oxygen he had. Panic breathing would have burned through oxygen faster and accelerated the hypoxia progression. Controlled breathing extended his functional time. Fourth, and perhaps most important, the cognitive discipline to recognize hypoxic symptoms and override the false signals his brain was sending. The euphoria that set in at 14 minutes should have made him relax, slow down, potentially stop cranking. His ability to recognize the euphoria as a symptom rather than reality, and to force himself to keep working despite feeling peaceful, was the difference between survival and death. The Air Force incorporated Wilson's survival into training protocols. Hypoxic tolerance training was expanded. Gunners were taught to recognize that calm, peaceful feelings at altitude with oxygen system problems were danger signs, not reassurance. The manual crank procedures were revised to emphasize slow, steady operation rather than frantic speed. Emergency oxygen bottle capacity was increased on newer aircraft models where possible. More significantly, the engineering response addressed the root cause. Oxygen hose routing was redesigned to minimize exposure to flak damage. Redundant oxygen supply lines were added to critical positions. Quick disconnect fittings were improved so switching between oxygen sources took seconds rather than the fumbling Wilson had experienced. Ball turrets on late war B-17G models included dual independent oxygen supplies with automatic switchover valves, but the modifications came too late for most of the war. Thousands of ball turret gunners flew combat missions with the same vulnerable oxygen system Wilson had faced. Not all of them survived oxygen failures. The difference often came down to the factors that saved Wilson: physiological advantages, cognitive discipline, and the ability to make calculated decisions under conditions designed to induce panic. Wilson's survival wasn't luck. It was physiology, psychology, and decision-making under pressure. He had advantages: the altitude adaptation, the partial oxygen flow. But the critical factor was his response. In the first 30 seconds after his oxygen line ruptured, when panic would be the natural response, he used those seconds to assess the situation. When every instinct screamed to crank frantically, he cranked slowly because he understood that speed would kill him faster than taking time. The ball turret was the most isolated, most vulnerable position on a bomber. Equipment failures that would be inconveniences in other positions were potentially fatal in the turret. But Wilson proved that even in that position, with life support systems failing in ways that should have been immediately lethal, survival was possible. Not through luck. Through understanding your body, recognizing your limitations, and making rational decisions when your oxygen-starved brain is screaming at you to panic. 3 minutes is how long medical science says consciousness lasts without oxygen at 25,000 feet. Wilson survived 6 times that long, most of it on 40% oxygen flow while performing exhausting physical work. He did it by treating the emergency as a problem to be solved rather than a crisis to panic through. Sometimes the difference between survival and death is the decision you make in the 3 seconds before fear takes over. Wilson made the right decision, and it bought him 16 minutes he shouldn't have had. 16 minutes that saved his life.